We are at the top of the hour, so I'm going to get us started. My name is Morgan Scott. I am EPRI's Director of Climate Ready, as well as our Sustainability and Ecosystem Stewardship Group, and I am incredibly pleased to welcome you to today's Smart Targets webcast. We are going to be talking about this new methodology for grounded and actionable climate targets that we are setting in terms of alignment with global goals, and really excited to be introducing this project and effort with you. A couple of notes around housekeeping as we get this conversation started. So you have been muted upon your entry, and we really want to hear your questions, but we're going to actually use the Slido panel, which you should have open, to submit those questions. So please feel free to send those in. Whenever you have them, I'll be monitoring the questions, and then when we get to the panel discussion is when I will actually bring those to the fore and we will have that conversation. But please feel free to send your questions in throughout the conversation. Please also note that today's webcast is being recorded, so your participation is your consent to that recording. We have also, in order to improve accessibility to today's conversation, enabled closed captioning. So in the bottom left-hand corner of your WebEx screen, you can open that closed captioning panel by clicking on that button. And of course, today's slides, as well as the recording of the conversation, are going to be shared with participants on today's call and made available publicly. So we will share more after today's webcast around how you will be able to access those materials. So like I said, we are really pleased to be here. This is the official public launch of Smart Targets. And so we have a great lineup in terms of today's conversation. So I'll share a few words about the project. Then we're really going to talk a little bit more in depth about the project itself with my EPRI colleagues, and I'll introduce them to you. And then really wanted to hear from stakeholders around some of their perspectives on the need and what we are actually doing and intending to accomplish through this particular effort. So we'll hear some comments, I will facilitate some conversation, and then as I mentioned, we will use audience questions to help move that conversation as well. We recognize that not everyone on the line may be familiar with EPRI, and so I thought it was important to start here and really share that EPRI is a nonprofit organization that is really focused on advancing research across the power system. So really thinking comprehensively about generation, T&D, the customer side of the equation, and really focusing on a collaborative model. And that's a really critical piece to this particular conversation as well, because it's about bringing together great experts when it comes to the science and the technical components of the work that we do, along with stakeholders and other researchers throughout various communities to ensure that the work that we are producing is really technically rigorous, scientifically defensible, and meeting the needs of not just the power industry, but also our own public benefit mission and society at large. So I'm not going to go into the details on this slide, and I'm going to introduce my colleagues individually, but I think it's important to recognize that there's a lot of participation in terms of expert panels and a lot of experience and expertise that is being brought to this particular project as we work to answer this question around how do we continue to expand and build methodologies for emission reduction target setting, again, aligned with global goals and that are actionable. And so I'm going to have both of my colleagues, Steve and Claudia, share a little bit more about the project, and then as noted, we will move into that panelist conversation. So today will be a great discussion, bringing a lot of perspectives together, and really we'll meet, hopefully, folks wherever they're at as we're thinking about setting, updating, evaluating, validating goals in terms of all of the different considerations and externalities that impact that. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So I mentioned my two colleagues who are going to first introduce the project. So Steve is a principal research economist in our Energy Systems and Climate Analysis Research Group here at EPRI. His research focuses on long-term modeling of socioeconomic system transitions, climate change drivers and management, and potential climate risks as well. Steve leads EPRI's research on global change and climate-related risks, and has served on numerous expert panels, as I mentioned before. So that includes the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, their advisory group, US EPA Science Advisory Board, and has also been a lead author on the climate scenarios and transitions for the IPCC's recent sixth assessment report. So Steve has a PhD in economics from Cornell University. And then my colleague Claudia is a principal technical leader also in our Energy Systems and Climate Analysis Research Group. Her research really focuses on climate-related transition risk analysis, GHG target setting methodologies, our conversation today, and climate risk disclosure. Actually, prior to joining EPRI, Claudia was at the federal government of Mexico, where she coordinated climate mitigation efforts and strategies across ministries, subnational authorities, and industry. Before that, she was a researcher at MIT Joint Program for Science and Policy of Global Change, where she actually earned her doctoral degree working on the economics of renewable energy. She's been a lead negotiator for carbon markets and technology development and transfer under the UNFCCC and a government representative to the IPCC. So as you can see, we have some incredible experience and expertise coming to the front here as we have this conversation. So Steve, I will turn it to you and look forward to hearing more about what this project is all about.
Perfect. Thanks, Morgan. You can hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. You can go right on to the next slide. We'll jump in. So the SMARTargets project we want to highlight has three major components. Of course, the first and foremost is the development of a new methodology and validation alternative for setting company-level greenhouse gas targets. That methodology is going to be based on scientific assessments and the insights that that assessment gleans and the particular guidance that it provides us. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. The second key component is scientific education, outreach, and resources. So in addition to offering a new methodology, the project is being designed to provide access to the science to help people understand what science is relevant to this topic and understand what it tells us and how do we utilize those insights. And that's critical to helping advance the conversation and having a more informed conversation. And the third critical component of the project is a stakeholder advisory coalition. And this is an opportunity for us to have direct stakeholder engagement throughout the development process of the methodology, as well as we think about outreach and communications. And really a critical part of our engaging with the broader conversation and being able to get input along the way. Next slide. So when we talk about scientific assessment, what do we mean? So about 6 years ago, Morgan and I began a stream of research associated with this topic, and it started with a very basic question, and that was simply asking, what is the relationship between a global average temperature goal and a company? And really trying to define that relationship as well as we could. So utilizing the available science as well as identifying gaps and trying to address that gaps to help us better understand that relationship. Of course, that means we need to not only think about atmospheric science in terms of how do emissions accumulate in the atmosphere and affect temperatures, but also means we need to thinking about different sources of emissions and the underlying activities and economies and technologies and policy that are associated with those sources of emissions. And that's really where we've spent a lot of time over the last few years, really putting together a stream of research, evaluating global transitions, and then also evaluating subglobal transitions. And in the latter case, we found there's really a lack of information in terms of understanding what are the possibilities for subglobal transitions. So I'm going to talk about some of our learnings from that work to help set the stage in terms of what we're trying to do in terms of the methodology that we're going to be creating. Next slide. So we've actually done quite a lot in terms of, like I said, a whole sequence of studies evaluating different potential elements associated with defining that relationship between an international temperature goal and a company. And these are some highlights from those learnings and really what we've characterized as requirements for a greenhouse gas target setting methodology to be based on science. And first and foremost is the importance of considering uncertainty. The future is uncertain. We don't know what the conditions will be in the future in terms of the size of the economy and its composition, the nature of technologies and available resources, as well as policy. Second important consideration here is recognizing uniqueness and recognizing that the opportunities for decarbonization vary dramatically from one part of the world to another, and also from one company to another. And that has to do with differences in assets, differences in markets, differences in systems, differences in local policy, as well as the demands of local communities. Third, is important to be thinking about accounting for multiple objectives. We need to be thinking not only about decarbonization, but the other social priorities that society has in terms of economic growth, in terms of jobs, in terms of services, and providing reliable and dependable goods and services. And fourth, it's also important to be thinking about providing flexibility. Because of that uncertainty, we need to be recognizing that different possible conditions can unfold, and being able to offer the opportunity to be able to respond to those different conditions, potentially having contingency plans as different potential conditions reveal themselves. And fifth, it's important to have robust strategies. And so recognizing that setting a greenhouse gas target is just one part of a broader strategy. And it's important for that greenhouse gas target to be aligned with overall risk management and objectives to ensure that it's going to be a part of a viable solution and resilient strategy going forward. So where do those come from? Next slide, please. So they come from the scientific assessment work that we've been doing. And what we've done here is summarized 8 specific points from that work that essentially lead us to those 5 requirements that I was just noting a moment ago. The first just starts out with evaluation of global transitions and recognizing that there are many global emissions pathways that are consistent with limiting warming to any particular temperature outcome, whether it's 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees. And that variation in different possible transitions represents important uncertainty that we need to be taking into account. On the right-hand side is a figure, and in the blue shaded area that's showing you the range of global emissions transitions consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And that range is, like I said, represents important uncertainty for a company and for planning purposes, uncertainty about economic growth and technologies and markets going into the future. And you can see that uncertainty is broad. If you look at it vertically in terms of potential emissions reductions by 2050, you see that a range of emissions reductions from well short of net zero to well below net zero. You also see it's broad horizontally in terms of the timing with which any particular emissions outcome is reached, like net zero timing in terms of a broad range of different possible years at which that point would be reached. So those important uncertainties are relevant to companies in their planning process and important for them to be considering. Another important issue in this space is that assumptions matter. So as we look at global pathway information and think about how it can inform our decision making, we need to recognize the assumptions associated with those results. And that will help us in terms of interpreting that information and applying it to whatever particular context we have. 2 critical assumptions in this space is the assumptions regarding the policy incentives driving decarbonization. And we find that it's typically assumed that there's a global policy that's applied across all nations and all sectors of the economy simultaneously. That, of course, is very different than what we're actually experiencing now in terms of global policies. And we need to be evaluating the uncertainty about those incentives that are driving the kinds of results we're seeing in global pathways. Another important assumption in those pathways is assumptions about the available technologies for different sectors of the economy in different parts of the world. So those 2 items alone, policy design and the availability of technologies, are critical uncertainties for companies to be evaluating. The work we've been doing evaluating sub-global potential transitions, if you look at point number 2 here, has also been highlighting that there's wide ranges of possible transitions at a sub-global level, whether it's national or it's for sectors within countries or on a local basis, that are consistent with limiting warming to any particular temperature outcome, but more importantly, consistent with any particular global emissions pathway. So we've been doing quantitative work evaluating potential sub-global transitions for different global emissions pathways and finding wide ranges of possible transitions could be cost-effective because of differences in potential conditions from a non-policy and policy design point of view. The third point is just highlighting that the uncertainties relevant in this space are not only those associated with things like economic development and markets, fuel prices, and available technologies, but also the uncertainty about policy design. As I mentioned, we don't have an idealized global policy applied to all parts of the world simultaneously. So we need to be thinking about what types of policies might be incentivizing decarbonization and what kinds of options might be available for decarbonizing. and that's a critical uncertainty for companies that needs to be evaluated and considered. The fourth point is just highlighting that regional opportunities vary dramatically. So when we look at what the decarbonization opportunities might be in terms of global regions or subnationally in terms of regions within countries, we find that those opportunities are radically different, having to do with differences in available endowments, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, as well as differences in the opportunities going forward and how they might potentially decarbonize. And that's an important consideration as well as we think about what one company might do versus another. The fifth point is just highlighting that it's not cost effective for all companies to have the same target. So because of those regional differences, we see that it's important to take that into account as we think about trying to pursue ambitious levels of decarbonization and recognizing that it's going to be, the challenge is going to vary from one company to the next. And so how can we actually take that into consideration as we're developing targets? Sixth point here is just highlighting that there's uncertainty about greenhouse gas target setting. So we've done some work evaluating illustrative companies and their potential decarbonization strategies under different contexts, and finding under 4 different contexts, they would have 4 different targets, under 8 different contexts, 8 different targets. So just simply recognizing that those conditions matter in terms of what would make sense and be practical for them. And the corollary to that is, because of that, setting a target has risks that need to be assessed and managed, associated with those different possible conditions that can unfold in the future. 7th point is just highlighting the importance of thinking about the available options. So constraining our decarbonization options has consequences, and those are trade-offs that we need to understand. That doesn't mean there aren't good reasons for thinking about sort of narrowing the space of what are available options, but it means it's important for us to evaluate the potential trade-offs of having a smaller set of decarbonization strategies available. And the potential trade-offs can include not only a more expensive transition or more challenging transition, but it could potentially mean the infeasibility of the goal itself. And the 8th point is really kind of a summary point. All the insights that we've managed to glean from the work that we've been doing has led us to conclude that global pathways have serious limitations as benchmarks for companies. So not only are there many global pathways, and it's impossible to justify choosing any one pathway, and they have strong assumptions that are uncertainties that need to be evaluated, they really aren't modeling companies. So as we think about the potential unique opportunities of individual companies and their locations, global pathways aren't designed to actually capture those kinds of possibilities, as well as their potential uncertainties and risks. So next slide. So just to give you a few examples of potential sub-global transitions and the importance of uncertainty in that space. On the left-hand side is work that we've been doing with MIT evaluating potential sub-global transitions consistent with individual global emissions pathway. So imagine a potential global pathway that the world decides to follow, and we can think about what might be the underlying conditions for countries, for sectors in countries that would be consistent with that transition. And in this context, we're evaluating uncertainties regarding non-policy conditions that affect the dynamics of economies, such as population growth and income growth, as well as available technologies and resources and preferences. And we're evaluating policy design uncertainty in terms of what might be the incentives and the available options for decarbonization. What's shown in the results there are the potential size of the U.S. power sector in 2050 for a single 2-degree global emissions transition. And you can see a wide range of possibilities. There's actually 1,200 different possible conditions represented in those distributions, 3 different policy design contexts and the different distributions shown in the different colors. And for each of those distributions, uncertainty about the non-policy conditions as well. That's an enormous possible variation in what the U.S. power sector might look like in 2050, anywhere from 1,500 terawatts to something over 5 times larger in that particular point in time. And that's important uncertainty for us to be taking into account as we think about planning for the future and recognizing both those policy and non-policy related uncertainties. On the right-hand side are results for different regions within the U.S. in terms of how they might decarbonize in the context of a U.S. economy-wide net zero strategy by 2050. So trying to achieve net zero by 2050 and looking at what kind of role individual regions might play we find that they actually have very different cost-effective decarbonization transitions. So 16 different regions within the U.S. are represented there. And each of those regions not only has different starting points and different transitions and different endpoints, the way they're actually achieving their emissions reductions is very different from one part of the country to another because of those differences in endowments, which include not only things like renewable resources, but also CO2 storage resources and infrastructure associated with power and gas systems, but also differences in the opportunities in which how they might pursue their decarbonization. A highlight there in 2050, you can see that not all the regions are actually net zero. Some are above and some are below, which is just going to this point that it's not cost effective for all companies, in this case, all sub-regions, to have the same target. Next slide, please. So those kinds of insights are the kinds of things that we need to respect as we're developing a methodology and inform how the particular elements or requirements for the methodology, like those 5 points that I highlighted a couple slides ago. So just to kind of summarize here, it's important that a greenhouse gas target setting methodology be designed to identify a practical and actionable target for each company. So recognizing their differences and thinking about what are the potential options for decarbonization and the uncertainties. It's also important to help the companies assess and manage the transition risk. That uncertainty is very real, and both in the policy design as well as the non-policy space. So being able to evaluate it, assess the risk, and think about management strategies for that risk is a critical part of this. It's also important to be able to help communicate on that risk management, and we think about disclosure as an important part of this conversation as well. And there's an opportunity to be creating the information needed for disclosure as well as the information needed for target setting. And finally, it's important to facilitate cost-effective decarbonization. The level of ambition here is significant in terms of what we're trying to do to manage the climate and characterizing those trade-offs and thinking about how can we facilitate the transition and put in place the enabling conditions for that transition are really critical going forward. If we don't design the methodology to take into account these issues, there's a good chance that the methodology results or the benchmark that's being produced will be intractable. We'll end up with very difficult conversations regarding how to move forward and what can actually be done. It can also potentially create risk for companies by not being aligned with their actual risk and their risk management, and potentially could be misleading to audiences like investors, as well as difficult and detrimental to the companies themselves and their communities. So with that, I'll pass it over to Claudia to talk about the project details a little more.
Okay, Steve. So EPRI's research and key insights that Steve have presented have led to this project we are launching today. We are excited to present the SMARTargets project. It has 3 specific activities. First, the development of a new methodology to set targets aligned with the Paris Agreement that are also actionable and grounded. Second, scientific education of public resources developed by EPRI. And third, a stakeholder advisory coalition with leading experts from the finance, environmental, standard-setting organizations, and industry. The goal of the project is to assist companies worldwide that need a scientifically sound approach and validation option in the evolving climate-related risk disclosure landscape. So next slide, please. The project timeline is 2 years. We have planned to develop the methodology during this year, and next year, EPRI will have an extensive outreach effort related to education, facilitating the methodology adoption and validation. The initial project scope includes electric, gas, and transmission and distribution utilities. However, we expect that many of the aspects of this methodology will be transferable to other sectors. Also, the project includes a peer review process of the methodology. This is to receive feedback from the scientific community. And finally, we will engage with potential third-party validators to ensure the methodology provides the required information to support target validation and also disclosure activities. I would like to clarify that EPRI will not be the validating entity. So with these details, Morgan, I would like to turn the mic back to you to hear from our panelists.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Steve and Claudia. I think it's really helpful to open this conversation with a discussion around these technical considerations, this piece of the science, and outlining the project plan. But now we have the rest of our time to really have a discussion and hear from stakeholders, both within industry as well as from the financial community, talk a little bit about what they're seeing, hearing, thinking, et cetera, as we think about taking on this project. So let me talk a little bit about how we're going to work this particular conversation. So I am going to introduce each speaker one at a time, although I welcome all three of our panelists to turn on their videos and join us, so to speak. And they're going to share a couple of opening words. Then I have some questions to discuss and open up this conversation. And we'll also take some questions from you all in the audience. So the final reminder before I introduce our panel is to go ahead and submit your questions. So we have the Slido panel as a part of this WebEx open. You can send those questions in to us, and we'll be happy to use those as we get the conversation going. So with that, I am actually going to start with Sandy Nessing. So Sandy, with 27 years in the utility industry, you have responsibility for leading corporate ESG and sustainability strategy, as well as disclosure, stakeholder engagement, and strategic initiatives for American Electric Power. So Sandy sponsors AEP's Enterprise Sustainability Council and chairs the corporate ESG committee. She also serves on the company's Risk and Resilience Subcommittee and facilitates AEP's Climate Change Executive Group. She leads AEP's engagement with EPRI's sustainability-related research initiatives and is a member of our Sustainability Leadership Committee. In 2023, she was named to Sustainability Magazine's Top 100 Women in Sustainability. So Sandy, welcome, and let you have a moment to share some opening comments and your perspective here.
Yeah, thanks, Morgan, and thanks for the opportunity to share some thoughts with this group. This is really a near and dear issue and project to me and many of my peers in the electric utility industry, because we have been having discussions around science-based targets with our investors in particular for the last couple of years at least. And we understand why it's important to them. They need to understand, they need some assurance that these are real targets, they're credible, they're achievable. But SBTI, which is the only game in town, if you will, for doing that as a third-party organization, really is not appropriate for our sector. And so that was, you know, a combination of the conversations we've had and the need to act and do something that meets our stakeholder needs. This is that project and that effort to do so. So really happy to get this work started.
Great, thank you so much. So next we have Teresa Kim. So Teresa Kim is the Senior Equities Research Analyst covering utilities and independent power producers at JP Morgan Asset Management. She provides utility and power infrastructure strategy and underlying regulatory analysis for stock investments. Prior to JP Morgan, Teresa worked at Jennison Associates, the public equity investment subsidiary of Prudential Global Investment Management, where she co-managed their utility fund, which has a 5-time Lipper Award winner and ranked high by Morningstar with a 5-star overall rating during her tenure. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I'm certain it's wonderful. So, the fund was ranked in the top quartile for 3-year, 5-year tenure and since inception period. Ms. Kim also co-manages the Carbon Solutions Fund, which invests in companies where business models are committed to energy decarbonization. Prior to Jennison Associates, Ms. Kim held roles at Solomon Brothers Asset Management, Bank of America Securities, and the United States Senate Banking Committee. She received a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from Wesleyan and an MBA in Finance from NYU in 1998. She holds a CFA designation and is a member of the New York Society of Security Analysts, the CFA Institute, and the EEI Wall Street Utility Group. So clearly some excellent experience here, and would love to turn to you, Teresa, to hear some opening comments and your thoughts in this space.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I cannot tell you how excited I am about this effort because I'm also a member of the proxy committee here at JP Morgan. So not only am I involved with sort of the investment decisions in the utilities, but also in the proxy voting for all sectors. And we have had so many internal conversations about SBTI, and we've came to a decision that we are not adopting SBTI because the goalposts seem to be moving around. And so I cannot tell you how excited we are, and even the folks here in the environmental group, the proxy committee, we have many committees here. We're looking forward to this. And I could go into detail later, perhaps, about how we ask companies for certain disclosures, but I could just leave that up for later. I just want to tell you, this is fantastic.
That sounds great. We will absolutely come back to that. So thank you for offering. But first, we'd love to hear from our third panelist. So Jamie Stouter is in the Senior Advisor role for Climate in the Office of Comptroller Brad Lander, and that's in New York City. In this capacity, Jamie drives the implementation of the New York City retirement systems, the teacher retirement systems, and the Board of Education retirement systems net zero by 2040 commitments through engagement with portfolio companies and asset managers. Prior to joining the Comptroller's office, Jamie was Vice President of Strategic Relationships at the U.S. Green Building Council, leading the organization's work on clean energy, power systems, and sustainable land development, working with business and government leaders to assist their efforts to meet climate, sustainability, and resiliency goals. Previously, Jamie was the head of built environment at the Clinton Global Initiative. While serving in this role, she advised multinational corporations, philanthropists, NGOs, global mayors, and organized labor to increase investments in green buildings, infrastructure, resilience, and cities. Jamie is a graduate of Tulane University in New Orleans and completed her Master's of Public Policy at Johns Hopkins University. Go Blue Jays. So Jamie, would love to hear from you some opening perspective before we get into the Q&A.
Sure. Thanks, Morgan, and thanks for having me today. As you just noted, I'm here representing the New York City Comptroller's Office and specifically the New York City pension systems. The Comptroller serves as a trustee, custodian, and investment advisor to 5 New York City retirement systems with about $240 billion under management. 3 of those 5 systems, which you listed above, have net zero by 2040 plans. Those plans are very much focused on engagement with our portfolio companies and engagement with our asset managers. With our portfolio companies, specifically in the public markets, the trustees have established a set of guidelines for how we can hit our net zero goals through this engagement process. The most relevant and important of which is that we have a target to have 70% of our financed emissions covered by third-party verified targets by June 30th, 2025, so quite quick, and that's scopes 1 and 2 financed emissions. After 2025, the goal increases to 90% of scopes 1, 2, and 3 covered by science-based targets by the end of the decade, so 2030. The plans lay out that the main things that we're looking for are that these targets are aligned with science, clearly, and third-party verified, so based on a third-party standard and third-party verification. To implement this process, we started looking at our highest emitting sectors, our in developed markets, and the utility sector really stood out, partially because these funds are divested from fossil fuel reserve owners, so there is a less of a footprint on the traditional energy side, and utilities represented our highest emitting sector in most metrics. For example, last year in the NYSERS portfolio, so the largest system, utilities were 3.6% of the weight of the portfolio and 27.6% of scopes 1 and 2 financed emissions. So fairly disproportionate contribution for obvious reasons. to start our effort, we reached out to about 35 U.S. utilities, and we've heard from many of them, as we heard at the top, of the challenges that exist with SBTI, and have been invited by EPRI to contribute to this process and are eager to do so. We know that utilities have a lot to manage: affordability, reliability, resiliency, making sure that customers are focused. But as long-term investors, we also see climate and meeting these targets as about risk and long-term performance. So we're open to new protocol. We're excited to engage in this process. I should note we have some reservations about an industry-led process, and our focus will really be around ensuring that anything that comes out of this process is not a greenwashing effort or just rubber stamping business as usual. We want to see ambition, science aligned, and gross emissions reduction. So looking forward to that and contributing with this lens.
Jamie, really appreciate that last comment. I think that's something we're really thoughtful about as well. It's why we've set up this stakeholder coalition to get perspective like yours to inform this process. It's why we plan a scientific review process on the methodology before publication. So very thoughtful that that will be an important piece of this overall process. I want to pick up on something that you said to start off the Q&A conversation. So you mentioned, utilities have a lot to balance when it comes to kind of managing these multiple objectives, so to speak, right? And you have really, with the New York City Comptroller Office, I would say, been leading a really important conversation with emissions-intensive sectors like the power industry, and really collaborating in a wide variety of investor initiatives as well, right, like Climate Action 100. So I'm curious, in those settings, is there a conversation about the economic impacts associated with these emissions targets, and how do you balance multiple objectives such as affordability for consumers as we are working towards these emissions reductions? Any thoughts on those various conversations you're participating in and how that's addressed?
Sure, and thanks for that question. I think it is a real challenge, or I guess it's several interlocked challenges, to be more precise, that we are not interested in supporting efforts that will drastically raise rates for consumers, while at the same time we're focused on mitigating the risks associated with climate change. And the targets and achieving targets is the work of this decade in many ways. I neglected to mention that we understand the pressures that regulators have, regulator pressure, and having to work with a regulator to enact change and achieve certain goals. This is one of the reasons why this effort makes a lot of sense to us in some ways, to have folks that deeply understand an industry be able to address these challenges that they deal with every single day. And we are working very closely with a lot of other investors. We are leading as the now called thematic lead for the Climate Action 100 Plus for science-based targets. So we are interacting with companies alongside our peers and other investors, and also representing them in some capacities as well. So we're feeding back what we're hearing through our outreach and engagement. As one of the only investors that have these very specific targets of our own around other setting targets. So we'll be collaborating closely with other investors moving forward and feeding our their thoughts and concerns and affirmations into this process as well.
Yeah, Jamie, really appreciate that. You mentioned regulators, and that points to the first question that I see has come in from our audience, which asked about sort of how do we account for the impact in different regulatory commissions. So I actually want to turn to Steve to answer that question a little bit from the project and methodology perspective. But then Sandy, maybe I'll see if you have some thoughts here as a company that operates in a regulatorily kind of confined space. And confined might not be the right word, but and get some perspective from you. So Steve, why don't you answer that from the project perspective first, though?
Yeah, sure. And just to build on the remarks that Jamie was making a moment ago, the sort of this question of balancing multiple objectives is one of characterizing those trade-offs and how those different objectives are affected as we think about different decarbonization options. And that's one of the things that the project is really trying to do, is think about these different possible transitions and be able to provide that information and then create for more informed decision-making about the target and about the strategy for achieving the target. Part of that is directly related to the question that was asked, and that is understanding the environment with which each individual company is operating. So companies have very different regulatory environments as well as expectations from their customers in terms of their needs, and being able to take that into account not only informs this thinking about the trade-offs, but it also allows them to end up with more practical and, like we said, actionable strategies for pursuing their targets and their strategies.
Yeah, perfect. Sandy, you want to follow up on that as a company thinking about just this?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, both of you hit on some really important points: the reliability of the grid, the affordability for every customer, that, you know, not only are the utilities under pressure for that, but so are the regulators. And I would also say that, you know, we also need to recognize that, like water, energy is very local, right? I mean, it's what the states want. And oftentimes the policymakers at the federal level and the state level want very different things. And we're operating in a highly regulated environment and have to navigate all those things while maintaining our pathway, if you will, toward net zero. So I think what's really important here is that flexibility that Steve talked about, and understanding that, you know, trying to meet a global pathway simply doesn't work in a local jurisdiction. And so we've got to find the right way to do this, again, aligned with the global goals, that also has the rigor that avoids what Jamie talked about, the greenwashing, because that's something that none of us want. We're very hawkish about that as we go into this initiative. And EPRI will tell you that I've been on, I get on that soapbox every time. But at the end of the day, it has to be something that's credible and trustworthy, has the rigor and assurance and the comparability that our stakeholders need. But it is a challenge. There are risks, there are trade-offs, and it's expensive.
Yeah, Sandy, appreciate that. And you also mentioned there are a lot of different stakeholders that want different things. Teresa, I'd love to kind of pull on that with you a little bit, right? So from where you sit and what you're doing, what information do you need from companies when you're thinking about their GHG target and the strategy for pursuing it? What are you looking for?
I think really the key factors are alignment and execution ability. So when I talk about alignment, I think about all the stakeholders, and we spoke to this already, which is the regulator, the governor, the legislature, the customers, the labor groups, et cetera. Are they all aligned in terms of the policy so that the utility is able to execute? And then when we look at those goals, and we do not prescribe any goals, by the way, but we do want to see if the strategy is aligned to those goals and if they're able to execute on that. So when I look at 2035 or even 2050 target, we don't really look at that far out in terms of 2050. When we get a goal that is out in 2050, we immediately ask for interim goals because we want to see steps to a 2050. For us, 2050 is almost meaningless. So then we look at then the ways in which they can get there. And obviously, as mentioned before, there are different paths. But we want to see actually if the company has means to actually make room for that investment in the bill. So we talked a lot about the affordability. Can the company perhaps do a lot more on, say, their cost structure on the operating and maintenance side to actually allow for investments to reduce emissions? That is a big factor. So again, it's alignment and execution.
Yeah, really appreciate that. Sandy, maybe as you hear what the investment community is looking for, maybe react to that as a company and then talk a little bit about the key challenges of then setting and pursuing those targets with a strategy and consideration of all of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that it is very challenging in the regulatory environment. Some states are all in on clean energy and net zero. They have their own goals, their own strategies, and they're pushing utilities to go with them in that direction. And that's fabulous. But you also have other states that just want to burn coal, don't shut down the coal plants. And so, it's very challenging to navigate, particularly in those instances. So, and the affordability, I mean, we're in 11 states across the country, and they're some of the most disadvantaged and low income communities as well. And so when we're thinking about how fast can we go, it's really dependent on what they can afford and what regulators will allow. So, and I know that both Jamie and Teresa know this. I find it interesting that 2050 is almost meaningless because it feels like, it's almost tomorrow. Time is going so fast. But I will say that, it's not a straight line to get there. There are going to be twists and turns. There's even going to be some detours. And we're kind of seeing some of that now with the concerns over capacity, because the pace of transition from the coal fleet in this country has gone faster than expected, and technology and other resources have not kept up with it. And so I think what you're seeing is that middle transition that's beginning to form. And that middle transition is, how do we make that bridge while those other things like technology catch up to it? So I think we're in a very interesting time. I would say that our industry is very committed to this energy transition overall. We'll get there. It's just, how do we get there and how fast can we get there?
Can I chime in on that?
Time. Please, Teresa, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, and I didn't mean to be so flippant on saying meaningless, but what I found with a lot of some of the strategies are placeholders for quote unquote new technologies, and it's really difficult to weigh what that means. So that's why it could be a placeholder for storage technology or small modular nuke reactors. So it's hard to get our arms around that.
Yeah, I totally understand that. It's hard for us too.
I actually have something to add here as well, which is, while the new technology is a major challenge, I think one of the benefits that we've seen with the SBTI protocol, recognizing the limitations that you all have identified, is the focus on interim targets and short-term targets that lead up to larger net zero targets. And that makes a lot of sense from a philosophical and implementation perspective, that we are looking at what are the immediate actions that can be taken in this environment, given the technology that currently exists, to achieve short-term goals, and then building to a larger net zero by 2040 or 2050, depending on the sector. And, I think from the technology perspective, it really does allow for the focus to be on gross emissions reductions rather than technology that may or may not be proven. And, I think we all know that given the massive influx of dollars into research and development and proving out new techs, we can expect to see some positive developments in that space. It's just hard to know at this time what that actually looks like and who will be able to access it and whatnot.
Yeah. And Jamie, maybe I can stick with you for a minute because Teresa mentioned what she's looking for is alignment and the ability to be actionable. And one thing that I know that you mentioned in your opening comments, what you're looking for is validation. And that is something that we have really been thinking a lot about already in this project is what does validation mean and look like? And I'm curious if you could reflect a little bit on what are you looking for from a validation process that gives you peace of mind around a target?
Yeah, great question. This is a really important area for us, and partially because of the volume at which we're looking. We're looking to kind of decarbonize our whole public portfolio with this approach. So it would be very challenging for an investor of our size, it's a universal investor, to look at every company's individual targets and evaluate them. We don't have the resources or capacity to do that. And we want to see standardization. So with those things in mind, this third-party validation is pretty critical. We need an independent body to put their stamp of approval that these targets were developed in accordance to a third-party developed standard that we are comfortable with. So it's both sides of that the standard be independent and then the verification process be independent. And this is an area that we see across our corporate stewardship work, that we are looking for that accountability that comes from having a third-party review particular activities and processes.
Yeah, really helpful. Teresa, I'm curious from the JP Morgan perspective, but do you think about validation of these targets and what's kind of that viewpoint you might have there?
So I would say we have certain products that are focused on sustainability. So validation would be paramount to those products. But I would say for our funds that don't have a sustainability mandate, it is all about the impact of, let's just say this, if they put out a strategy and they're not hitting the financial metrics for that strategy, that's what we're focused on. And validation, as much as that is very important, is probably not the top priority. It is more about returns.
Yeah, excellent. I want to make sure I get to the questions that folks have been sending in. So I'm going to take the easy one around, will the slides be shared later, which is yes, absolutely. So we'll be sharing materials. There will be both slides and a recording. And then I'm going to punt the harder one to Steve. So, and it's a great question though, right? Jim mentioned, I like the fact that the methodology will go through peer review. Will that include publication in academic journals of the methodology and that associated peer review process? So can you talk a little bit more about how we're bringing that kind of that standard or scientific perspective into the development process?
Yeah, it's sort of multidimensional. Obviously, we're relying on the science, so assessing the information that's available and the new information that emerges as we're working on the methodology is going to be a key part of our activities, and taking those learnings and applying them in the development of the methodology, as I've already shown you in the slides I discussed, is one way we're connecting to that science. The peer review process itself, good question about whether we'll be publishing the methodology in a journal article. I guess we'll see whether it's the kind of thing that would be suitable for an academic journal, which has different interests in terms of what it would like to publish. So certainly our primary audience is to provide a methodology that can be taken up by the public, that we're putting it out into the space that companies can apply, or that consultants working for companies can apply, and that those interested in the third-party methodology or the validation roles can be a part of as well. So that's certainly our number one audience, is really trying to offer something that can be practical and useful. Whether that reaches a journal article standard for intellectual merit, we'll have to see kind of where we end up in terms of our innovations from a scientific point of view.
Yeah, perfect. Excellent. I don't see any more questions in the queue from the audience, which is totally fine. Please feel free to continue to add them, but maybe I'll turn the kind of end of our conversation to the bigger picture around regional emissions. And Teresa, I know JP Morgan has emissions reduction targets for different sectors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious the extent to which you think about the interactions across sectors and economy-wide decarbonization when assessing investments. And then Sandy, maybe I'll turn to you to talk a little bit about maybe how you think about this bigger picture of economy-wide emissions reductions and AEP's role in that, and how you pull that into your strategy and target as well. But Teresa, some initial
Mm-hmm.
thoughts?
Yeah, we do have different perspectives when it comes to different sectors, and how we look at it is, is there a material risk on the financial metrics? And so we weigh the materiality. So and I think this panel has said it before, which is utilities are more exposed, right, to climate risk and emission risk. So we would actually have a bigger ask for the utilities than we would say other sectors where perhaps it's more of a technology company. I would say though, when it comes to, and I think we mentioned a little bit about scope 3, right? And that's where we're really challenged right now because, you talked about regional emissions, but when we look at our portfolios, we recognize for scope 3 that we could be double counting in our investment portfolios. And so right now we're trying to weigh, how do we manage that? Because in aggregate, that could not mean anything. So don't have anything else to share other than the fact that we're trying to figure out how to manage that. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's really helpful insight. And I'll just, before I turn this question to Sandy, I think that question around scope 3 emissions is a big question and one that we've thought a lot about already for this particular project and methodology, and certainly we'll continue to discuss and think about in the weeks and months to come. But Sandy, any thoughts from your standpoint as a power company on this question around regional emissions and the role you have and how that fits in here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's multiple sectors involved, right, in the energy transition, and we see it a lot. I mean, we have the potential for demand to outstrip supply, right? I mean, the demand for clean energy is just growing exponentially. Every data center that opens wants to be 100% clean energy. Fleet electrification is taking off with the big companies who have those major fleets. And I think there's going to need to be a lot of investment in the grid. I think there is a lot of investment happening in modernizing the grid. And I think that's, we're going to need to do that. When we do that, the grid becomes more efficient as we bring on those renewables. It becomes cleaner as well. And you start to address those regional emissions. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I think transmission, for example, is underrated as a real a tool that we absolutely have to have in order to enable this transition. So I will pause
Jamie,
there.
you're nodding your head. Does that kind of gut check with you as well? Any final comments to add here before I close this out?
I don't have much to add outside of the fact that it does to me make sense to really look at this from a holistic business perspective and think about all lines of business and how they tie together, and the gross emissions and how to reduce those. So nothing earth shattering for me, but agree with Teresa and Sandy as well.
Yeah, and Steve, quickly something to add here. I know we think a lot about this around enabling conditions and the big picture. Quick add before I close this out.
Yeah, just to keep in mind that we're trying to decarbonize whole economies. And so as we think about the role of individual companies, we need to be thinking about the relationships with the other sectors and how do we put in place those enabling conditions that will allow us to sort of facilitate that transition for the whole economy. And that's really important, and that's not necessarily a part of the current conversation. People are sort of isolating the individual pieces, and we lose those opportunities and potentially make it a lot harder.
Yeah, well, that is a perfect place to end. So I just want to say a huge thank you to our panel. Really appreciate you sharing candidly your perspectives and thoughts as we move forward with this project and the development of the methodology. A reminder to those on the line, we will be sharing slides and the recording. And if you're interested in learning more, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. I've got our comments or our email addresses here, so you can reach out to us anytime. We're happy to have conversations about the work ahead and appreciate you all joining us. So thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day. The conversation will most certainly continue, and appreciate starting it here with you all. Have a wonderful day.